Before the discovery of anesthesia, surgery was not just a medical procedure. It was an act of endurance. In the medieval era, doctors operated without the luxury of pain relief, sterile environments, or modern tools. And yet, people still went under the knife, conscious, terrified, and often tied down. How did surgeons of the Middle Ages manage such an impossible task? In this video, we're diving into the raw, brutal, and astonishing world of medieval medicine. In the medieval world, pain was not only a part of life, it was an inescapable reality of medicine. There were no anesthetic gases, no numbing injections, and certainly no understanding of neurological pain receptors. Surgery was a last resort, feared by both patient and physician. The very word surgery invoked dread. To undergo a procedure meant to face the knife fully awake, with only the thinnest hope of survival and no guarantee of relief. Patients were often brought in screaming, not just from their injuries, but from the knowledge of what was to come. Before the operation began, they were sometimes made to confess their sins, as death on the table was a very real possibility. Friends, family members, or assistants would hold them down. Sometimes 4 or 5 strong men needed just to keep one person still. In more structured settings, crude straps or ropes were used to bind the arms and legs, ensuring the patient wouldn't thrash during the excruciating process. The surgeon needed a steady body to work on, even if the patient's cries echoed through the stone walls. The pain was unimaginable. A simple amputation of a leg or arm involved slicing through skin, hacking through muscle, and sawing through bone, all while the person was conscious. Blood gushed freely, staining the wooden floor and surgeon's apron. The smell of sweat, iron, and terror filled the air. Some patients passed out from the sheer shock of it, while others remained wide-eyed and fully aware through every second of agony. There were accounts of people biting through leather straps, their own tongues, or even their hands in a desperate attempt to distract themselves from the searing torment. In many cases, doctors encouraged patients to drink copious amounts of alcohol beforehand, not to dull the pain so much as to dull the memory of it. Mead, wine, or strong spirits were the poor man's anesthetic, and even then, they provided only a sliver of comfort. Some doctors used blunt force, hitting the patient over the head with a heavy object to knock them unconscious before cutting began. But this was risky, potentially fatal, and not guaranteed to work. Even more disturbing was the philosophical view of pain at the time. Pain was often seen as a divine punishment, a form of penance, or a test of one's soul. To endure suffering was noble, even godly. Clergymen might be present during surgery, not to intervene medically, but to offer prayers and moral support. A person who survived an operation without crying out might be praised for their spiritual strength. Others, unable to bear the pain, were sometimes labeled as weak, sinful, or cowardly. In some texts, there are even accounts of saints and martyrs undergoing painful procedures as a demonstration of their holiness. What we now see as trauma was often brushed aside. There was no concept of post-operative therapy, emotional care, or psychological recovery. The focus was survival. If a patient lived, the operation was a success, even if they were permanently disfigured or mentally scarred for life. For those who didn't make it, it was often chalked up to fate, bad humors, or God's will. In the medieval world, the line between medicine and torture was razor thin. To choose surgery was to submit oneself to the fire of suffering. It was an act of desperation, of courage, or perhaps of madness. Yet it was also the beginning of a long and painful evolution, one that would eventually lead to the modern miracles of painless surgery, sterile technique, and humane care. But back then, all that waited was the knife, the pain, and the hope of waking up on the other side. The tools used by medieval surgeons were not instruments of healing in the modern sense. They were instruments of survival, and often of suffering. Crude, unrefined, and terrifying in both appearance and function, these tools were designed with one primary purpose in mind: speed. The longer a procedure took, the greater the chance of death from blood loss, shock, or infection. Precision was a luxury. Efficiency was the standard. Among the most common tools was the amputation saw. Roughly forged from iron or steel, it resembled a carpenter's saw more than a surgical device. Teeth jagged and wide, it could tear through bone quickly, but not without causing immense trauma to the surrounding flesh. In some cases, surgeons would have multiple sizes of saws for different limbs, though in many rural or battlefield settings, only one was available for everything. These tools were rarely cleaned, let alone sterilized. They were used repeatedly, often crusted with dried blood and fragments of tissue from previous patients. Then there were the knives, small, curved, and wickedly sharp when newly made, though quickly dulled with repeated use. These blades were used to slice through skin and muscle, to lance abscesses, and to remove tumors or foreign objects. Surgeons would sometimes carry a kit of blades in leather rolls, pulling them out like a craftsman preparing for work. The edges were honed on whetstones, but rust and corrosion were constant issues. Infection was a silent killer, and the tools themselves were often the cause. Cauterization irons were another standard implement. Long rods of metal with flat, rounded, or forked ends were heated in open flames until they glowed red hot. After a limb was amputated or a deep wound cut open, the iron was pressed against the flesh to seal blood vessels. The sizzle of burning flesh filled the room, along with the thick, choking smell of smoke and blood. Patients screamed, writhed, or fainted. Some even died on the spot. But cauterization, as brutal as it was, could save lives by reducing bleeding and the spread of infection. Hooks and retractors were used to pull back skin, muscle, or internal organs. Often, these were little more than iron tongs bent into shape, their rough edges cutting into flesh as much as holding it aside. There were also forceps, large, awkward tools used to grasp objects deep within wounds. Surgeons used them to remove arrows, stones, or splinters. In some battlefield situations, they were used to extract bits of armor or bone fragments, often without the benefit of light or cleanliness. Trepanation drills, used to bore holes into the skull, were among the most harrowing instruments in a medieval surgeon's possession. These drills came in several forms, some manual, operated by hand, and others using a bow-like contraption that spun a sharp point. The procedure was performed to relieve pressure in the skull, treat head injuries, or, according to superstition, release evil spirits. A surgeon had to be careful not to puncture too deeply, or the brain itself would be damaged, leading to immediate death. Yet without modern imaging or knowledge of cranial anatomy, success was often a matter of luck. Needles and sutures existed, but they were thick, stiff, and clumsy. Made from bone, bronze, or iron, the needles were threaded with animal sinew, or linen threads soaked in vinegar. Sewing up a wound was painful and crude. There were no fine stitching techniques, only what would hold the body together long enough to heal. Some wounds were left open to drain, while others were packed with herbs, moss, or cloth. The results were unpredictable. Even more disturbing was how these tools were maintained, or rather, how they weren't. There was no concept of sterilization. Boiling water, alcohol, or flame was occasionally used, but more out of habit or convenience than medical necessity. In most cases, tools were wiped off with a cloth or rinsed in whatever water was available. The same saw that cut through a plague victim's leg might be used on a soldier's arm the next day. The idea of microscopic germs wouldn't emerge until centuries later. Surgeons carried their tools in boxes, rolls of leather, or wooden chests. Some were traveling physicians, moving from village to village, performing surgeries in barns, kitchens, or marketplaces. Others worked in monastic hospitals or battlefield tents, where the environment was equally unhygienic. Instruments were laid out on wooden tables, stained with blood, and rarely cleaned between uses. Despite their barbaric appearance, these tools were the best medicine had to offer at the time. Each blade, saw, and iron was a reflection of the medical understanding of the era. They were crafted not with precision engineering, but with blacksmiths' hammers and fire, and yet they saved lives. Crude though they were, they marked the beginning of surgical science, a harsh, painful beginning born out of necessity, desperation, and a willingness to cut into the body in search of healing. In a world without anesthetics, medieval surgeons turned to nature and to desperation for anything that might ease the agony of their patients. The understanding of how to dull pain was limited, and it was often entangled with folklore, trial and error, and sheer hope. Instead of scientifically tested compounds, they relied on herbs, roots, potions, and rituals passed down through generations. These early attempts at pain relief were crude, unpredictable, and often dangerous, but they represented the beginnings of pharmacology and the enduring human desire to reduce suffering. One of the most famous and infamous plants used for pain was the mandrake root. Shaped eerily like a human figure, the mandrake was steeped in myth. It was said to scream when uprooted, killing anyone who heard its cry. Despite, or perhaps because of, its dark reputation, it was prized for its soporific and hallucinogenic effects. Physicians would grind it into a powder or boil it into a potion, which the patient would ingest before surgery. The right dose might dull pain or render someone semi-conscious. The wrong dose could cause hallucinations, madness, or death. Poppy was another widely used plant, especially in the form of opium. Though its effects were not fully understood, its ability to numb pain and induce sleep was recognized. It was often boiled into teas, mashed into pastes, or dried and smoked. Some monks and herbalists even made rudimentary tinctures using alcohol as a base. These mixtures were sometimes given before procedures like bone setting, lancing abscesses, or even amputations. Again, the problem was dosage. Without standardized measurements, each patient reacted differently, and what might sedate one person could send another into a coma, or worse, fail to do anything at all. Another powerful but highly dangerous plant was hemlock. Most commonly associated with the death of Socrates, hemlock was used in very small amounts as a sedative. It could reduce muscle spasms and dull the senses, but it was also a potent poison. Physicians who dared to use it had to tread carefully. There was no antidote, and even a slight miscalculation could paralyze or kill the patient. Still, in the absence of true anesthesia, the risk was often deemed worth it, especially in cases where the alternative was pain so unbearable it could cause the patient to go into shock or die during the procedure. Henbane, another member of the nightshade family, was used in similar ways. It caused drowsiness, delirium, and occasionally unconsciousness. Mixed with wine or other herbal ingredients, it formed part of what some medieval texts referred to as a sleeping draught. Recipes varied wildly, with additions like belladonna, deadly nightshade, lettuce seeds, vinegar, myrrh, or even bits of poppy sap. These concoctions were imprecise and often mixed by monks, apothecaries, or village herbalists who relied on experience more than exact knowledge. One of the more famous medieval texts to mention these herbal sedatives is the Antidotarium Nicolai, a medieval pharmacological manual that included recipes for painkillers and sleeping potions. Some mixtures were applied topically, infused in oils or soaked into cloth and placed on wounds. Others were burned as incense or inhaled through steam. Occasionally, poultices made from crushed herbs were applied to the temples or chest to soothe anxiety and pain. None of these methods worked reliably, and the results could range from mild numbing to uncontrollable vomiting, hallucinations, or sudden death. Alcohol was the most accessible and widely used painkiller of all. Strong wines, meads, and spirits were consumed in large quantities before surgery, both to dull the pain and to embolden the patient. In many cases, the goal wasn't to numb the body, but to cloud the mind. Drunkenness, though crude, was at least predictable. Some surgeons would soak cloths in wine or vinegar and press them to wounds in the hope that it would provide some minor relief and reduce the chance of infection, though the latter was poorly understood. Interestingly, hypnosis or distraction techniques were also occasionally used, though not in the formalized way we think of today. A patient might be told to focus on prayer, on reciting religious texts, or even on gripping a sacred object such as a cross or rosary. In some regions, charms and talismans were employed, believed to hold spiritual power that could ease pain or offer divine protection during a procedure. The psychological comfort of faith, while not an anesthetic in the clinical sense, could play a powerful role in calming the mind and preparing the soul for what lay ahead. Some surgical centers, especially those affiliated with monasteries, had access to rudimentary cooling methods. Snow or cold water was applied to numb a limb before cutting, though this was mostly seasonal and rarely effective for deep procedures. Still, any method that reduced sensation, even briefly, was welcomed. Despite all these efforts, most patients experienced surgery in full, harrowing awareness. The herbal sedatives were inconsistent at best and fatal at worst. The dream of a pain-free operation was centuries away. What the medieval world lacked in technology, it tried to make up for with tradition, courage, and a raw kind of human ingenuity. These early experiments, though flawed and often dangerous, paved the way for the discovery of ether, chloroform, and the development of modern anesthetic science. In the end, the use of natural remedies and crude anesthetics wasn't just about managing pain. It was a testament to humanity's enduring refusal to accept suffering without resistance. Even in the darkest times, people searched for ways to ease the burden of the knife, to silence the scream, and to offer, if only for a moment, some mercy in the face of unimaginable pain. Surgery in the medieval era was never just a physical act. It was deeply rooted in a complex web of religious belief, superstition, humoral theory, and cultural tradition. In an age where science was still in its infancy and religion reigned supreme, the human body was not seen purely as a biological entity, but as a spiritual vessel, affected as much by invisible forces as by physical ailments. As a result, medieval surgery existed at the uneasy crossroads between medicine and mysticism. The knife, the prayer, and the curse all held equal weight in the minds of patients and physicians alike. One of the most influential medical frameworks of the time was the theory of the four humors, inherited from ancient Greek thinkers like Hippocrates and Galen. According to this theory, the human body was governed by four fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Health was thought to be the result of balance among these humors. Illness, including physical injuries, resulted from imbalance. Surgical procedures were often guided not just by necessity, but by the perceived need to restore this equilibrium. For example, bloodletting, one of the most common and dangerous medieval practices, was frequently performed not because it made anatomical sense, but because it was believed to release excess blood and restore harmony. The use of leeches was a direct extension of this belief. These creatures were placed on the body to draw blood from specific regions, often prescribed for anything from fever to inflammation to mental illness. Surgeons and barbers alike practiced these techniques as standard treatments, often in conjunction with more invasive procedures like lancing boils or draining abscesses. If a patient survived, it was assumed the humors had been successfully rebalanced. If they died, it was either because the disease was too strong or because divine judgment had been passed. Alongside humorism, religious interpretation of illness played a central role in shaping the experience of surgery. Disease and injury were frequently seen as manifestations of sin, punishment from God, or trials meant to purify the soul. This belief extended into the surgical chamber. Before undergoing an operation, many patients were urged to confess their sins, make peace with God, and even receive the Eucharist. Death was always a possibility, and being spiritually prepared was seen as just as important as physical survival. The presence of priests or monks during surgeries was not uncommon. They would recite prayers, anoint the sick with holy oils, and offer spiritual comfort. Some believed that prayer alone could heal, and surgery was to be pursued only after divine intervention had failed. In more extreme cases, patients believed their suffering would earn them grace in the eyes of God, a concept known as redemptive suffering. For these individuals, enduring the knife without complaint was not only a show of courage, but a sacred act of faith. Superstition further clouded the line between medicine and magic. Some believed that illness came from evil spirits, demonic possession, or the evil eye. In such cases, a surgeon might be called not to cut, but to perform a form of exorcism. Incantations, talismans, and charms were employed to ward off malevolent forces. Herbs like garlic, St. John's wort, or wolfsbane were used not only for their physical effects, but also their supposed spiritual power. If a wound refused to heal, it wasn't just an infection, it might have been cursed. Even certain surgical procedures, such as trepanation, the act of drilling or scraping a hole into the skull, were performed with both medical and mystical intent. While trepanation could relieve pressure from head trauma or swelling, it was also believed to allow evil spirits to escape the body. The patient, screaming and bleeding, was not just being treated, but symbolically purified. This blend of medicine and metaphysics was deeply ingrained in the worldview of the time. Barber surgeons, the most common medical practitioners, often straddled multiple roles in society. They cut hair, pulled teeth, performed surgeries, and even assisted in executions. Many were illiterate, relying on rote training passed down from mentors or local tradition rather than academic study. Their shops displayed painted signs or poles, red for blood, white for bandages, to advertise their services. Their knowledge of anatomy was rudimentary at best, and many relied on astrological charts to determine the best days for procedures. The position of the moon or stars could influence whether an operation was thought to succeed or fail. There was also a significant gender dynamic in medical superstition. Women, particularly midwives and herbalists, were often accused of witchcraft if their healing practices strayed too far from accepted norms. In some cases, a woman who successfully healed a patient that a male surgeon could not might find herself accused of dealing with the devil. Thus, even healing became a dangerous act of rebellion in a society dominated by fear, ignorance, and patriarchal control. In larger cities, universities and medical guilds began to emerge, slowly introducing a more structured and empirical approach to medicine. But even these institutions were steeped in religious doctrine and classical texts, some of which had not been challenged for over 1,000 years. Dissections of human bodies were rare and often forbidden, making it nearly impossible for surgeons to understand internal anatomy with any real accuracy. What they lacked in scientific knowledge, they made up for with improvisation, tradition, and sheer force of will. In this deeply superstitious world, the surgeon was more than a medical practitioner. He was a kind of ritual specialist, part butcher, part priest, part alchemist. The act of cutting into the body was both terrifying and sacred, a moment in which the veil between the physical and spiritual was momentarily lifted. Every operation was a gamble not just with life and death, but with the unseen forces believed to shape fate. And for the patient, the decision to go under the knife meant more than risking pain. It meant confronting the deepest mysteries of the human condition with nothing but courage, faith, and hope for deliverance. As brutal and primitive as medieval surgery may appear from the vantage point of modern medicine, it was a crucial step in the long, painful evolution of human understanding. Every grisly amputation, every agonizing cauterization, and every bloodletting born from misguided theory laid the groundwork for future advancements. Out of the shadows of suffering and superstition emerged the first flickers of scientific inquiry, a slow, uneven awakening to the true nature of the human body and the mechanics of healing. In the earliest stages, the battlefield became an unexpected school for surgeons. War, with all its carnage, provided a grim but necessary laboratory. Soldiers returned from the front lines with mangled limbs, shattered bones, and festering wounds. While many died from infection or blood loss, others survived, thanks to quick, decisive, and sometimes lucky surgical interventions. These battlefield experiences forced practitioners to think on their feet. Techniques that once relied purely on ancient texts gave way to methods born out of urgency, experience, and observation. Surgeons began to recognize patterns, what worked, what didn't, and how speed could mean the difference between life and death. One of the earliest signs of surgical evolution was the improvement in amputation techniques. Early medieval amputations were barbaric affairs, often performed with dull blades and no thought of tissue separation. But over time, surgeons learned how to cut through muscle in layers, how to tie off blood vessels more effectively, and how to shape the stump in ways that would allow for better healing and even, eventually, the use of rudimentary prosthetics. Tourniquets, simple but effective bands to stem bleeding, started to appear in surgical practice, saving countless lives. In the 14th and 15th centuries, the catastrophic impact of the Black Death paradoxically accelerated medical progress. As plague ravaged Europe, it undermined trust in traditional medical authority. Physicians who had once clung blindly to ancient Greek texts began to question the wisdom they inherited. Many of the old cures failed, and the sheer scale of death demanded new approaches. The urgent need to understand the human body pushed some brave individuals toward dissection, which had been previously outlawed or considered taboo. Slowly, and often in secret, human corpses were studied not as vessels of sin, but as anatomical puzzles waiting to be solved. Universities and medical guilds, particularly in Italy and later France and England, began to legitimize the study of anatomy. Though still heavily influenced by the works of Galen and Avicenna, these institutions fostered a spirit of curiosity. Texts were copied, translated, and distributed more widely, especially after the advent of the printing press in the mid-15th century. This innovation revolutionized the dissemination of medical knowledge. Surgeons and physicians who had once relied solely on oral tradition or scribbled manuscripts could now study diagrams and detailed anatomical descriptions. Medical books were still rare and expensive, but for the first time, knowledge had the potential to outlive its teacher. One of the most significant transitions during the late medieval period was the separation of surgery from barbering. Originally, the barber surgeon was a single profession, someone who could cut hair, extract teeth, and amputate limbs. But as surgical skill developed and became more specialized, the need for dedicated surgical practitioners grew. In cities like Paris and London, surgical guilds began to emerge, offering formal apprenticeships and organizing public dissections. These early institutions paved the way for modern surgical colleges. Another leap came with the introduction of antiseptic practices, though these would not be fully understood until much later. Some medieval surgeons began washing their hands or instruments in wine or vinegar, not out of knowledge of microbes, but because they noticed it seemed to help reduce festering wounds. The connection between cleanliness and survival was beginning to form, albeit slowly and without the benefit of germ theory. The development of wound care also began to shift. Rather than packing open wounds with moss or dirt, surgeons experimented with herbal salves and honey, both of which had natural antibacterial properties. Cloth bandages soaked in wine or oils were applied more regularly. Surgeons even began to stitch wounds closed, using techniques passed down and refined over generations. The late medieval period also saw the emergence of some of the earliest surgical textbooks, such as Guy de Chauliac's Chirurgia Magna, Great Surgery, written in the 14th century. A French surgeon, Chauliac synthesized classical knowledge with his own experience treating patients during the plague. His work became a cornerstone of European surgical education for centuries, and it reflected a growing respect for surgery as a learned art rather than a grim necessity. Yet, for all these advancements, progress remained slow and uneven. In rural areas, old practices persisted for generations. Superstition and religious dogma still held sway over many aspects of medical thinking. Bloodletting and humoral theory remained dominant well into the Renaissance, and many patients continued to die from infections that would later be easily preventable. The idea of pain-free surgery remained a fantasy. No matter how skilled the surgeon, the knife still bit as sharply, and the screams were just as loud. Still, the seeds of transformation had been planted. What began as brutal guesswork guided more by fear than understanding, was gradually becoming a profession of inquiry and discipline. Medieval surgeons, flawed and fallible as they were, laid the stepping stones for the breakthroughs to come. Anesthesia, antisepsis, and the intricate surgical marvels of the modern world. Their work, often performed in candlelit rooms with crude instruments and desperate patients, was the foundation upon which modern medicine would rise. They operated in darkness, but their efforts helped bring light to future generations, and in doing so, they turned pain into progress, superstition into science, and survival into a craft worthy of study, refinement, and respect.